For many years, the galaxy looked at Earth and saw nothing special. They saw a small blue planet on the edge of a quiet arm, in a forgotten corner of the Milky Way. They did not think about humans. They did not fear them. They did not even remember their name. To most advanced species, Earth was just one of many silent worlds full of noise, but lacking power. No one visited Earth, and Earth sent no visitors, no warships, no trade, no threats, only silence. That silence ended one day when something massive appeared at the edge of known space. A single object came out of the dark. It did not answer hails. It did not send a signal. It did not change course. It moved slow and steady through deep space. It had no fleet around it, no escort, no warning, just a single ship the size of a small moon. The first to see it were the Dalek, a peaceful race of star cartographers. They were not fighters. They only watched and recorded and sent reports to the Council. Their long-range scanners lit up with warnings when the ship entered the map zone. The readings made no sense. It was not a fleet signature. It was one object, over 20 kilometers long and wide, shaped like a spear with glowing blue lines running across the black hull and a faint golden shield rippling around it. The Dalek could not understand. They sent scans and data to the nearest Alliance outpost. The message was marked urgent. The reply came fast and confused. The scans were real. The ship was real, and it was heading straight toward the core systems, but it was silent like a ghost. It had no weapons drawn and no life signs detected, only energy readings too high to calculate. Other races began to notice the great ship passing through their space. They tried to contact it. They tried to warn it. They even tried to stop it, but the ship ignored them all. It changed course only when needed to avoid collision. It fired no shots. It spoke no words. It kept moving forward slow and calm. Some believed it was a rogue planet. Others said it was a hidden weapon from an old war. A few thought it might be a lost AI gone mad, but no one had answers, only questions. Then the message came. It was not a voice. It was a thought, a feeling sent through subspace. Every species near the object heard it in their own language and in their own mind. It came like a whisper, but stronger than a scream. We are humanity. This ship is our voice. The galaxy stopped. The emissary, that is what they later called it, but at that moment it had no name. It was just the message and the ship together, a symbol of something new and unknown. Humanity had been quiet for so long that most races forgot them. Some never even heard of them. Earth was not part of the Galactic Council. It had no ambassador, no allies, and no known military presence beyond its home system. Yet now a single human ship traveled deep into Council space without fear. The ship passed systems that once ruled empires. It moved near stations with fleets ready to fight, and it passed unchallenged, not because it was invisible, but because no one dared to test it. The Ralvec tried. Once they were proud and bold and did not fear unknown things. They sent 6 ships to intercept the human vessel. They sent a standard warning. They charged weapons. They moved in formation and blocked the path of the emissary. The human ship did not stop. It did not speed up. It did not change direction. It moved like a river around rocks, silent and unstoppable. The moment the Ralvec fired their warning shot, the human ship responded not with weapons, but with light. A soft blue pulse spread from the tip of the ship across its surface, then outward into space. And in that moment, every Ralvec ship shut down, not damaged, not destroyed, just off like a light turned off by an unseen hand. Their ships drifted powerless for an hour. Then their systems came back with no error, no damage, and a single message left in their logs. This is our voice. We do not shout. We do not beg. We do not run. That message spread like fire across the stars. Every network, every channel, every leader heard it and asked the same thing. What does humanity want? Why are they here? Why now? But no answers came. Only the ship, only the silence, only the growing tension that followed its slow path through space. People began to fear, but some began to wonder. What happened on Earth in all those years of silence? What did humanity build in the dark while the galaxy watched other wars? What made them send this ship now? The emissary kept moving. Stars passed behind its systems. Ahead grew brighter. It neared the heart of Council space and the galactic core itself, where the oldest and most powerful species ruled. The Council called an emergency session. They debated for days on what to do. Some wanted to destroy the ship. Some wanted to welcome it. Most simply wanted to understand it. But no one could agree. Meanwhile, the emissary kept moving. More species tried to contact it, more ships flew near it, some even scanned it up close. They found towers, domes, weapons, ports, gardens, energy sources, language libraries. But no crew, or at least none. They could detect the entire ship seemed alive and aware, but in a calm and peaceful way, as if it waited for something or someone. Then a second message came, just as soft, just as clear. We come not to conquer, not to beg, not to kneel. We come to share, to warn, to remember. The ship slowed as it reached the edge of the core systems and turned slightly to face the center of the galaxy. Its energy flared brighter than before, not as a weapon, but like a beacon, like a lighthouse in space. Species began to gather, some with fear, some with hope, all watching the emissary as it prepared to speak again. And the galaxy listened. The ship did not stop, and the ship did not turn, and the ship did not speak again, but it kept moving toward the heart of the galaxy, as if nothing could stand in its way, and for a while nothing did, until the Ishal Empire took notice, and the Ishal were not like the peaceful Dulek or the curious Ralvek. They were proud, strong, old, and powerful, with a long history of domination and control across many sectors. They ruled dozens of systems and hundreds of worlds, with fleets that moved like storms and minds that trusted only strength and order. And when they saw the emissary move into their border without request, without greeting, and without fear, they saw it as an insult, and they saw it as a threat, and they prepared their response. The Ishal War Council moved fast. They studied the scans and reviewed the reports and sent a message to the High Command. The humans have sent a test, they said, and we must answer. And we must answer with fire and steel and strength. They dispatched a full response fleet, 20 ships of war, all armed, all trained, and all ready to destroy if needed. And they moved into position across the path of the human ship, blocking the star lanes, and powering weapons, and sending a single clear message to the emissary: you are in violation of Ishal space. Turn back or be destroyed. The human ship did not turn, and the human ship did not fire, and the human ship did not reply, but it slowed just a little, as if to listen, and then it kept moving forward, as if the fleet before it meant nothing at all. And the Ishal commander gave the order for a warning shot, not to harm, but to show force and prove control, and a single pulse cannon fired toward the front of the emissary, and it hit nothing but light for the energy shield of the ship, bent and absorbed a shot like water catching a falling leaf. There was silence across the fleet, and tension rose, and the commanders waited for retaliation, but none came. And then every ship in the Ishal fleet flickered and dimmed, and the lights on their control decks blinked out, and their engines fell still, and their weapons powered down, without warning, and without damage, and without sound, and every screen across the Ishal armada showed a single phrase in their native script: this is not an act of war, this is an act of patience. The message repeated once, and then vanished, and power returned, and systems rebooted, and every ship floated in silence as the emissary passed between them slowly, calmly, and without fear, and none of the Ishal dared to follow or block or speak again, and the entire empire stood still as the ship moved deeper into space, and the emissary left behind not ruin or fire, but confusion and quiet, and questions no one could answer. Words spread faster than light across the galactic networks, and every race that once ignored Earth now wanted to understand it, now needed to understand it, because never in memory had a single ship faced such force without returning fire, never had a vessel spoken with silence and been heard more loudly than any weapon, and never had humanity shown itself in such a way. Speculation filled the news grids. Some said the emissary was not just a ship, but a weapon beyond understanding. Others claimed it was unmanned and run by an ancient Earth AI that had gained full awareness and purpose. Some feared it was the start of a secret invasion, while others believed it to be the first step in a long-awaited union. And among the people of the stars, two feelings grew stronger with each passing hour: curiosity and fear. The Galactic Council formed a new task force to study the emissary and make contact with it. They sent envoys from multiple world ships with peace banner scientists, with translators, priests, with offerings, and drones with questions, but the emissary gave no answer and no change in course, and only continued on its path toward the core, where the ancient halls of council stood watching, waiting, and worried. Meanwhile, deep within the emissary, a signal stirred. It was not heard by any outsider, not seen by any sensor, and not caught by any probe, but it moved through the ship like breath through lungs and awoke a chamber hidden within its center, a place lined with memory crystals and echo walls and chairs shaped like nothing else in the galaxy. And in this chamber, a single figure opened its eyes and saw the stars for the first time in decades. The figure stood slowly, stretched its limbs, and looked at the data flowing through the walls and smiled, for the mission was still on course, and the galaxy was still blind, and the message was still unfolding, and outside no one knew what had truly begun. Back in council space, the leaders of many worlds argued and planned and feared the ship. Some wanted to stop it with everything they had, others wanted to welcome it with open arms, and others still suggested leaving it alone. But the people of the stars had already chosen their side, for millions watched the emissary with awe and hope, and millions more with dread and caution, and in homes and halls and ships across space, stories of humanity began to grow. They said Earth had been broken once by its own wars, and had rebuilt in silence without asking for help or permission, and they said the emissary was not just a ship, but a monument to human survival and strength, and they said it was built not to conquer, but to teach, to remember, and to protect, and those who heard the whispers began to see the ship not as a threat, but as a warning, as a promise, and as a beginning. And through it all the emissary moved forward, slow and steady and patient, as the stars turned and the world watched, and the figure within walked to the core chamber and spoke a single word into the heart of the ship forward. And so it went. The emissary kept moving through space, untouched and unchallenged, and behind it the echoes of silence followed like a shadow, growing longer with every light here. And though the ship had spoken few words, the meaning was clear, and every species now understood that Earth had changed, and what once was quiet now carried the weight of power. The Council feared that silence more than any weapon, and they sent scouts and scientists and envoys to try and learn, but none could enter the ship, and none could speak to it, and none could understand how it worked, and the more they watched, the more they saw that the emissary was not just a ship, it was something different, something alive, and something old yet new. Inside the ship, halls stretched for kilometers, and lights pulsed like blood through veins, and great chambers opened with no doors, and walls shifted like water when touched, and deep within that strange place the figure that had awakened now walked in silence, guided by light and memory and purpose, and his name was Ashen, and his role was Keeper the Message, and he had waited many years for this moment. Ashen was human in shape, but changed by time and training and machines. He did not age like others, and his body held knowledge instead of weakness, and he could hear the emissary like a song beneath the metal, and he knew every system, every story, every choice that had brought this ship into being, and he was not a captain and not a soldier and not a king, but something in between. He walked to the central dome, a vast sphere of glass and metal and light, where stars were mapped and voices were recorded, and where history itself lived in silence. And he placed his hand on the core panel, and the ship responded not with sound, but with warmth, and he saw again the memories of Earth before the silence, before the emissary. He saw the wars that burned cities and skies, and the peace that followed like smoke after fire. And he saw how humans turned inward not to hide, but to rebuild, and how they vanished from the stars not from fear, but from choice, and how they crafted the emissary not as a weapon, but as a voice for what they had become. Outside in space, more ships watched from afar, afraid to get close, and too curious to leave. And among them was a vessel from the Threx Dominion, a race of data seekers and archivists who recorded everything and feared nothing, and they had sent their best mind, a being named Velar, who had studied every species known and every signal found, and now stared at the emissary with wide eyes and a racing mind. Velar had seen warships and dreadnoughts and carriers and relics of ancient power, but nothing like this ship, nothing so large and quiet and full of presence, and he begged his leaders to let him try contact one more time, and they agreed, and he sent a simple message in every known code. "I do not come to stop you, I come to understand you." The emissary did not answer for a long time, but then its outer lights changed shape, and a small vessel detached from the hull and drifted toward Velar's ship, and it carried no weapons and showed no threat, and docked with slow precision and opened a single door, and inside was a single chair and a single screen and a single line of text. One may enter to learn, but must not lie. Wheeler entered alone, and the door closed behind him, and the emissary accepted him not as guest, but as witness, and the screen showed him things no outsider had seen before, and the voice of Ashen spoke through it like wind in the trees, calm, steady, and true. You ask who we are and why we have returned, but the truth is we never left. We listened while others spoke, we watched while others fought, we learned while others forgot, and we built not in pride, but in pain, and now we carry our memory, so others may remember before it is too late. Wheeler stayed for hours that felt like days, watching the rise and fall of civilizations and the path of humanity from fire to silence to stars again. And when he returned to his ship, he said only this to his people. The emissary is not a ship, it is a story, and if you do not listen, you will miss your place in it. Back on the emissary, Ashen watched the stars shift around the hull and felt the ship breathe beneath his feet, and he knew they were close to the council worlds, now close to the center of everything, and close to the moment the message must be spoken to all at once, and without fear. He entered the bridge, a quiet place with no chairs and no screens, only floating lights and shifting shapes, and he stood in the center and closed his eyes and whispered one word: begin. The emissary pulsed with light and sent out a signal, not as sound, but as thought, not as demand, but as invitation, and every mind across the sector heard the same thing in their own voice and their own soul. We are humanity, and we have returned not to rule, but to remind, not to demand, but to share, not to warn, but to witness, and we bring not warships, but truth, and not power, but memory. And if you wish to know us, then listen. The signal ended, and the stars seemed still, and the galaxy waited again in silence. But it was not the silence of fear or ignorance, it was the silence before an answer, the silence before something new. And Ashen stood alone at the heart of the emissary, and felt the weight of 1,000 years settle on his shoulders, and he smiled, not in pride, but in hope, and whispered once more forward. The emissary moved like a shadow across the stars, and its light carried a voice that needed no volume, and no anger, and no fear, and as it passed through the edge of the core systems, many species who once ruled great empires now watched in silence, because the stories they told each other in secret were no longer just myths or whispers or forgotten files. They were now warnings and echoes and truths returning in the shape of a ship too large to ignore and too calm to stop. But not all who watched believed in peace, and not all who listened heard wisdom, because in a dark belt of shattered moons and broken planets, there waited a fleet not of empires and not of nations, but of predators and thieves and warlords who called themselves the Crawl, and who had no fear of legends and no care for meaning, and they saw the emissary not as a message, but as a prize. The Crawl had taken ships from fallen worlds, and had turned science into weapons and peace into traps, and they saw in the emissary a thing that could make them gods or kings or something worse, and their leader, a being called Herrick, made of steel and flesh and rage, gave a single command to capture the ship and rip it open and learn its secrets and take its light and silence for their own. They launched with speed and power, with stealth drives and magnetic slings and twisted fields to hide their trail, and within hours they surrounded the emissary like wolves around a calm beast that did not fear teeth and claws, and Herrick sent a broadcast to all his vessels with a promise of glory and spoils and history. But the emissary did not react, it did not run, it did not fight, and it did not speak, and that silence made the Crawl grow louder and bolder and more certain that they were in control, and they sent drones with claws and lasers to breach the outer hull, and they fired pulses and anchors to lock the ship in place, and they prepared boarding teams with blades and shields and screams of victory. And then the lights on the emissary changed not into red or flashing signals of attack, but into waves of soft blue and gold that rolled across the surface like tides across a quiet sea, and all the drones and pulses and anchors simply stopped as if they had never moved at all, and the boarding teams found themselves standing still, not by choice, but by will, as if the ship had touched their minds and asked them to wait. Inside, the emissary walls shifted and formed a room that had never existed before, and at its center rose a pedestal with a single artifact on it, a smooth silver cube humming softly like a heartbeat, and Ashen stood before it and placed his hand upon it, and whispered a phrase in a language only the emissary knew, and the ship responded not with force, but with memory. Suddenly, every crawl ship received a data stream unlike any they had ever seen, not noise, not commands, but images, stories, thoughts from thousands of years of human survival and struggle, from the first fire to the last breath of old Earth, from the rise of cities to the silence of stars, from the screams of battle to the quiet of creation. And the stream did not stop until every crawl mind had seen what humanity had seen and felt what it had felt and known what it had known. Herrick screamed in confusion and rage and fear because he could not understand how something so still could show him things he could not forget, and he ordered the fleet to fire everything at once to break the emissary apart and erase what it had shown. But the weapons did not fire, and the systems did not respond, and the engines shut down like tired lungs because the emissary had not disabled them with power or hacking, but with understanding. And when the crawl ships drifted in silence, the emissary opened a single calm line to every vessel and sent one sentence in every tongue. "We do not destroy those who do not yet see." The crawl did not reply, and did not pursue again, and did not speak of what they saw to anyone, because what they saw was not war or victory or death, but themselves reflected in a mirror held by something older and wiser and more broken than they could understand, and many among them left the crawl name behind that day and vanished into space to find meaning in silence. The emissary continued forward as if nothing had happened, and Ashen returned to the central dome, where stars danced like fireflies and systems whispered new messages, and he watched as news of the encounter spread across networks and channels and worlds, and how the story changed from fear to wonder and from suspicion to reflection, and how some began to see the emissary not as a threat, but as a test. Among those who listened was a scholar named Ilari from a moon of the Vari cluster, a race known for patience and thought, and she had studied the old tales of Earth before it vanished, and she had once believed they were gone forever or lost of their own hands, but now she saw the emissary, and she saw in it a chance to understand the turning of time and the power of remembering, and she sent a message to the council asking for permission to board. The council did not respond quickly because they were still divided, and many feared what truth the ship might reveal and what it might say about their own history and their own silence in times of human suffering and absence. But Ilari did not wait, and she left in her own ship with only her words and her faith and her questions. And the emissary welcomed her with open passage and a single word in return: "Enter." Ilari stepped into the emissary with slow breath and steady hands, and as the door closed behind her, she felt no fear and no danger, only silence and warmth and a strange pull, as if the ship itself was alive and watching and waiting, and the hallway before her shifted with every step, as if guiding her not through metal and wires, but through memory and time. And as she moved, she realized that this was not a ship made by hands alone, but by purpose and pain and something older than design. The walls were not still and flat, but full of motion like glass filled with flowing water, and through them she saw images not of war or machines or power, but of Earth as it once was, green and broken and rebuilding, and she saw children playing beneath cracked towers and cities, rising from ash, and humans teaching each other again how to dream, how to build, how to live without fire and fear, and how to turn silence into strength. She followed the current of the ship deeper into its heart, past gardens with trees that grew without soil and lights that glowed like suns held in glass, and statues made not of stone, but of memory, and all around her she heard no voice and no words, but the pulse of a ship like a heartbeat, calm and strong and eternal. And then she entered a chamber larger than any she had ever seen, and at its center stood Ashen. He stood like a shadow cut from light, tall and calm, with eyes that held years and scars and wisdom. And when he turned to her, he did not speak, but bowed and raised his hand, and the chamber around them shifted and showed the stars moving slowly like rivers in the dark. And Ilari knew this was not a place for power or for politics, but for truth. Ashen stepped forward and placed a small device in her hand, and it lit with a soft blue light. And in an instant her mind filled with images of Earth, not as it was, but as it is now, and she saw a planet still hidden, still quiet, but no longer afraid, and she saw people building great cities beneath oceans and inside mountains, and across the void, and she saw minds linked through light and thought and machines that healed instead of harmed, and she saw people who had chosen not to rise through war, but through understanding. Ilari fell to her knees not in fear, but in awe because she had read of humans as broken and angry and loud. But now she saw them as patient and powerful and full of a sorrow that had become strength, and she understood why the emissary was silent, because it carried not pride or threat, but a warning written in the language of peace. Ashen spoke then not with sound but with thought, and he showed her the room of weapons deep within the ship where no outsider had gone, and she saw machines of war beyond measure and tools that could burn stars or stop time or shatter gravity, and they were not powered on and not armed and not touched because they were not built for glory but for memory. He showed her one weapon, in particular a device, so small it could fit in her palm, yet so powerful it could erase a planet. And it was marked with a single phrase in ancient human script, never again. And Ashen said, only this we do not show these to boast, we show them. So you understand our silence is not weakness, our kindness is not surrender, and our presence is not a request. Ilari wept then because she saw the truth not hidden behind walls or secrets, but open and clear and terrible and beautiful. And she asked Ashen, why now? Why reveal this to the galaxy? And his answer was not a speech or a story, but a vision. She saw a future where stars went dark and where empires fell and where the same mistakes repeated like echoes through time. And she saw a chance to change that, to turn back the tide not with force, but with memory and unity, and the emissary was the key, not as a weapon, but as a mirror and a message and a path forward for those willing to listen. Ashen reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, and in that moment she felt not like a visitor or a scholar, but a witness and a messenger, and the room filled with light as the ship accepted her as part of its story and showed her things no alien had seen and no council had imagined. She saw the first blueprint of the emissary drawn in a cave beneath a mountain by a blind engineer, guided only by voices of those lost in war, and she saw the first metal forged not in factories, but in silence and mourning, and she saw the first launch where no crowd cheered and no banner waved, only a whisper carried through the wind, we remember. Ilari rose then and bowed, not to Ashen, but to the ship and the silence and the sorrow that built it, and she asked what must be done now, and Ashen said, only this: carry the truth, and speak it without fear, and do not let them forget. The emissary opened a new path and guided her back to her ship, and she left without guards or orders or warnings, because the message had been shared and the voice had been heard and the story had begun to spread. As she left the chamber, Ashen returned to the dome where stars swirled like thoughts and futures, and the emissary continued forward with no change in speed and no sign of force and no sound, but the entire galaxy felt the weight of its presence and the light of its memory, and many now wondered what the council would do when the ship finally arrived, and whether they would listen or turn away or try to silence the silence. And the emissary moved on. The council chambers had never been so full and never so quiet, and across the great ring of lights and marble and shadow the leaders of 100 worlds sat, without speaking, without blinking, without even breathing, it seemed, and the screen above them showed the emissary still moving toward the heart of their space, still silent, still glowing, still impossible to ignore, and now they had to decide not just what to do, but who they were. Some spoke first with anger and fear, and they called for weapons and fire and ships to intercept and stop what they called a symbol of human arrogance and threat. And they said the galaxy could not bend to a single voice, no matter how calm, no matter how strange, no matter how old. Others rose and said that force had failed, that the emissary had passed every fleet and trap and danger without harm, and without harm given. And they said that if the ship had come in war, the stars would already burn, and that silence was not weakness, and peace was not surrender. And they asked for listening and patience and time. Voices clashed like storms, but no decision came, and while the leaders argued, the people outside the chambers had already begun to choose, because stories from Ilari and Velar, and even the crawl now traveled from system to system and station to station, and more citizens believed that the emissary was not a threat, but a mirror, and that the real danger was not the ship, but the fear inside themselves. Marches began on worlds that had never known protest, and lights were lit in patterns that matched the emissary's glow, and ships began to paint their hulls with blue and gold to show respect or hope or longing for something they could not yet explain, and poets wrote verses in honor of the silence. And children asked their teachers why Earth had been forgotten and why those who came with open hands were now seen as enemies. In a quiet corner of the council hall, one voice rose without shouting and without fear, and it was not a leader or a general or a noble, but a translator named 1’s who had served for years between species with no fame and no power, and 1’s asked a question that froze the room and echoed louder than any command. If this ship had come from anyone but Earth, would we still fear it, or do we fear it because we left them behind? The question hung like a shadow over every decision and every plan, because deep in the hearts of many leaders was a truth they would not say out loud, that Earth had once asked to join and had once called for aid and had once sent envoys who received no answer and no welcome and no voice at the table, and that silence had not come from Earth alone. The council voted in secret, and the results were not released because they did not agree and did not decide, and so the emissary continued forward unchallenged, but not unnoticed, and above them, all beyond screens and shields and distance, the ship watched and waited. Inside, the emissary Ashen stood before a wall of shifting light that showed the thoughts of the galaxy, not as words or numbers, but as waves of color and motion, and he saw the fear still pulsing, but fading, and he saw the hope rising not like fire, but like the first breath after drowning, and he knew the time had come to speak once more. He walked to the center of the bridge and placed his hand on the core, and the ship pulsed with energy that reached across the void and entered every network and every channel and every language, and across 1,000 worlds the emissary spoke not with demand but with invitation. We are humanity, and we are not your past, and not your future, but your reflection and your warning and your chance. And we did not come to rule or to run, but to offer our silence as proof of what we have learned, and our presence as proof of what we have survived. And we do not ask for seats or favors or names, but for memory and for change. The message ended, and the stars held their breath, and on the council world a group of ships rose from the hangars, not with weapons, but with light, and they flew to meet the emissary in peace and in witness, and aboard each ship was one person chosen by their people to listen and to learn and to carry the truth forward. When the ships reached the emissary, the great vessel opened its outer doors for the first time since its launch and allowed them inside, not as guests and not as leaders, but as voices, and each was given a chamber of learning and a chamber of memory and a chamber of silence. They saw the same things Alari had seen and Velar had seen and Herrick had refused to see, and they wept and they asked and they remembered and they changed, and when they returned to their worlds they no longer spoke in fear, but in wonder, and they told the truth of Earth not as a myth, but as a map for what the galaxy might become. And far below the bridge of the emissary, in a room with no name and no sound, Ashen stood before a statue of a child holding a flame, and he placed his hand on the cold stone and closed his eyes and thought of Earth not as a legend but as a promise, and he whispered into the silence that surrounded him. They are listening now. The emissary reached the galactic core where stars burned brighter and time moved slower, and power sat heavy on every station and every throne, and yet when the great ship arrived it cast no shadow and made no demand. It only slowed and turned and waited like a teacher before a quiet class, and all across the stars people held their breath and waited too, because they knew the final message was near and no one could guess what it would be. In the central chamber of the emissary, Ashen stood alone before a ring of lights that circled the ship's memory core, and in those lights were the names of every human who had lived and died in the silence, every name recorded and remembered and never spoken aloud, until now. And Ashen raised his voice not to shout, but to carry weight, and the ship opened its voice to the galaxy for the last time. We are humanity, and we remember what was forgotten, and we carry what others buried, and we walk where others turn away, and we do not bring fear, and we do not offer surrender, and we do not follow, and we do not rule, and we do not come with fleets or banners or flags. We come with memory and with truth and with a single purpose: to remind the stars of what they have lost and of what they can become. The message traveled through every relay and every channel and every system and every world felt the weight of it not as sound, but as thought, and not as force, but as choice, and across the galaxy ships lowered their shields, and soldiers dropped their weapons, and children looked at the sky with wonder instead of fear. On Council Worlds, leaders gathered again, but this time not to argue and not to command, but to listen and to remember and to ask the question they had avoided for too long: what do we do now? And the answer came not from a vote, and not from a speech, but from the people who had seen the emissary and walked inside and felt the silence and returned forever changed. They said, "This is not an enemy. This is not a warning. This is a gift, and it must be answered not with power, but with purpose." So they built something new. A circle of memory made from stone and glass and song placed on the edge of the core, where all ships could see and all species could meet. And in the center, they placed a light that never went out, and beneath it the words of the emissary carved in every language known. We do not kneel, we do not forget, we offer our hand, not our throat. And above that circle the emissary hovered in silence, still alive, still watching, and still waiting, but no longer alone, because now ships came not to chase or fight, but to learn and to listen and to carry what they had seen to others. Ashen stood once more before the stars, and opened a final chamber within the ship where no one had gone, not even him, and inside were 7 seats made of crystal and light and air, and one by one the chosen from across the galaxy were invited to sit not to rule, but to witness and to carry the message further than Ashen ever could. And when they sat, the emissary changed, not in shape, but in feeling, as if it breathed again, and its lights grew brighter, and its path grew longer, and its journey was no longer a return, but a beginning. And Ashen smiled for the first time in many years, because he knew he was no longer needed. He walked to the garden near the center of the ship, where earth flowers grew in still air and soft light, and he sat among them, and closed his eyes, and let the ship carry him forward into peace, into memory, into the silence he had once feared and now loved. Outside, the stars moved slowly, and the emissary moved with them, and across 1,000 systems people built new schools and wrote new songs and spoke of humanity not as a myth or a monster, but as a mirror that had shown them who they were and who they could be. And no one forgot again. Not the silence, not the sorrow, not the strength. The emissary moved on.